In 2010, something quite significant happened regarding the Ferry Commission. Bill 20 was passed in the legislature, and it added a new requirement to what the commissioner is to do. And that requirement is that we consider the interests of ferry users. And it seems like kind of an odd thing to be introducing late in the game. But from our point of view, it's a bit of a confusing idea because it isn't actually defined, and it isn't clear what we can do with it. As I said, the Act is very prescriptive. The formulas are all laid out in great detail, and so having done the calculations that the Act requires, if we're then to consider the interest of ferry users, the question we had is, well, what do we do with that consideration? There's nothing in the Act that allows us to change anything, adjust anything, bring any consideration to bear, and so we felt that it would be very important to understand exactly what was intended by government when they made that change before we made a decision that would stand for 4 years. So we decided to get that clarity right away, and on the 13th of May, Sheldon and I delivered a letter to the Minister of Transportation asking for A, clarification on what it meant, secondly, what tools we have to do something after we've considered those interests. And we actually assembled a list of over 20 questions related to that latter part of the question. So the minister wrote back to us right away, agreed that a review would be appropriate at this stage, at the 8-year point of its life. And in order to give us the mandate to do the review, they actually had to pass another piece of legislation, which was Bill 14, that went through the House in the spring. And not only did it give us the mandate to do a review, it also gave us time. And time, frankly, was in many ways more important than anything. Because what we didn't want was to do a review, bring recommendations that we thought could improve the Act and the ability to serve or at least consider the interests of ferry users after we'd made a 4-year decision. So government, in giving us the time, set the first year of the 4-year price cap at 4.12% for the whole system. So the minor routes is lower than what it would have been. And then we'll come back in and set the remaining 3 years, but potentially with some new rules to work with. So the bill passed on June 1st, and we held our first consultation meeting on the 6th of June at the north end of Vancouver Island. And we've been on the road pretty steady since then, traveling up and down first the Central Coast and the North Coast and Haida Gwaii. And we started there for obvious reasons, to avoid weather problems, because we knew we wouldn't have any problems down in the south. So we did get all those done through the course of the summer, and we've been in southern Gulf Islands and Sunshine Coast, and of course now we're in this area. And we'll finish up public consultations, meetings at least, within the next 2 or 3 weeks. We have 2 streams to this review process. The first stream is the public part of it, and really in many ways the most important part of it. We really do want to hear what the ferry system means to communities, the effects of how the system's worked over the last 8 years, and people's advice on how to make it work better. The second stream is we've engaged an expert company to give us advice on how price caps are operated in other parts of the world. Our price cap in the ferry system here was actually quite a new idea 8 years ago. It's become adopted for the administration of airports and rail companies and utilities and lots of other things over those 8 years. So we want to see what's been learned. And secondly, we want to look at how ferry systems are regulated in other countries as well. So we'll be looking at the Alaska ferry, the Washington State ferry, the Australian ferry system, the Scottish ferry system, and the Atlantic Canada system. At the end of it, we're going to be writing the recommendations, and I just want to underline that. We didn't want to have an international expert come and tell us how to run the ferry system in BC. We want to learn from what's going on around the world, but we think BC is unique and the solutions need to make sense here. So again, that's why we think the public consultation is the more important part of our process. So some of the things we're looking at and that we want you to give us your thoughts about, and I don't want this, by the way, to limit anything you want to say to us, but we just want you to have at least some starting point for the discussion today. We need to, first of all, define, what does consideration of ferry user interest mean? And by the way, the term ferry user is what's in the Act. That's why we're using it. Some people have suggested that's not the best way to describe ferry users, but regardless, that's what's there. But we think it's a three-part question. And the first part is, so who are ferry users? And, the kind of narrow, obvious answer is people who ride on ferries. But, the broader answer could well be including a lot of people who may not ride on ferries, but depend on ferries because they have hotels and restaurants, they run fishing companies and tour operators. It may be people who live in the mainland and have families that live on islands. They depend on the ferries to keep their families connected and to see their grandchildren and so on. So we really want to make sure we get the who are the ferry users question answered correctly, so that when we consider the interests of ferry users, we're considering the right group of people's interests. Second part of the question is what are ferry users' interests? And what we've heard loud and clear is affordable fares, for sure, reliable services, safety, and so on. But we're also hearing a lot of ideas that aren't so obvious in terms of the interests of ferry users, in terms of the interests of the hotel operators, and restaurant operators, and what they need in order to have an ability to be successful with their businesses on these islands, and to be able to depend on having the traffic they need coming on the ferry to keep their businesses viable, and so on. So the last part of the three-part question is, what does it mean to consider something? And so when we're trying to think of this in the context of, as regulators, after we've decided whose interests it is we're considering, what do we do with it? It may mean just thinking about those interests, but it may mean going a lot further into requiring the company to do certain things, to have good consultation processes, to have advance notification, and who knows, it may even go much further than that. Second thing we want to try to define is this whole notion of what does reasonable and affordable mean. Ferry costs are certainly rising, there's no question about that, we've been hearing lots of feedback about the impact of fares. We haven't heard many people say they think ferries should be free, so somewhere between free and the current cost, we think there is a definition for what's reasonable and affordable, and there needs to be a way to define it so it would potentially stay that way into the future. We need to better understand what it means to ensure the financial sustainability of the operator. This is another significant term in the Act that isn't defined, and we think we need a lot more guidance on it. There are 6 principles in the legislation, and they guide everything else. And I just want to go through them quickly because I think they're important in terms of understanding how this Act works to drive the ferry business. And really the question we're asking is, are these the right principles? Are there different principles that should have been or could now be added, and should some of these principles really be removed or fundamentally changed? So the 6 principles that are in the Act today: priority must be given to the financial sustainability of the operator. Number 2, the operator must take a commercial approach to its business. Third, the company needs to seek out alternate service providers to bring a level of competition into the service. Fourth, the company must minimize its expenses. Fifth, there should be an elimination of cross-subsidization between route groups. And sixth, there should be a user pay principle at work. So those are the six, and one of the things we're very interested in is what you think of those 6 principles and what additional principles you think would be more appropriate. Another thing we're looking at is whether the company is sufficiently accountable. And one of our principal roles after we've finished the price cap process is to hold the company accountable over the course of the 4-year term of the price cap to make sure that they actually operate within it, but also that they adhere to the requirements of the legislation generally. So the question is the company sufficiently accountable? Is it transparent? Do you have an opportunity to understand what they're doing? And do we have the tools we need in order to make them be fully accountable into the future? So these and other topics are being posted to our website. We have a website called bcferrycommission.com, and if you have the ability to check into that site from time to time, there will probably be 10 or 12 or maybe even more discussion topics being posted. We're looking for people to give us their feedback on any or all of them. And of course, write to us about any other topic you want to discuss. You can email us, you can write to us, you can tweet us. I'm not sure I know exactly what to do when I get a tweet, but somebody telling us does, and we'll be able to do that. Now, if you have any written submissions or notes that you want to give to us, we'd be more than happy to take those today. If you're going to make some comments from notes, hang on to them, give them to us after you've made your comments, and we'll take those away. At the end, we're going to make recommendations to government about the Coastal Ferry Act. We don't make legislation, we can't require change, we don't have any way of predicting whether government will take any or all or none of our recommendations. But having said that, I think it's significant that government passed legislation to give us the mandate to do this review. They're listening to us, we're getting lots of encouragement and support from the minister to do the review and to be thorough. So I do think this is a great opportunity to see change if change is needed. And just to remind ourselves that it doesn't happen very often. It's been 8 years since the Act was created. There have been a couple of reviews of a financial nature by the Auditor General and the Controller General, but this is the first comprehensive review of the Act, and whether it's doing what it was intended to do. I don't think you'll see another review of it for a good long time. So if you want to see change, now's the time to speak up and offer your suggestions and hopefully creative solutions. So Sheldon's the Deputy Commissioner. Did you want to say anything, Sheldon, before we get going? So I'm going to pull the podium out of the way and sit down and take lots of notes. I have Don Rugg here is with us. He's also taking notes, and he can take any submissions you might have. But we really like to just spend the rest of the time listening to you folks. So thank you.
Just quickly before we start, I said 6 to 8 for the meeting. Well, it's apparently 7 to 9 tomorrow, the open house.
Thank you for clarifying that. I'm hearing both all over the island, so I wanted to know if we could go before we go to choir.
Well, they'll probably be there. I'm picking them up on the ferry, so they'll probably be there setting up, so drop in anyway.
Okay.
I'd like to invite everybody to speak up too, because we don't have mics today.
I'll stand up and shout. How's that?
No problem with you, Doug.
Yes, sir. That's usually I'm humble. First of all, Ron, Tony, Verna, Rich is on this afternoon.
All right.
Power or not.
That's important.
And I jotted some headings down here because when I stand up like this, I tend to forget what I was going to say. First thing is, on your way out of here, on your way to Denman, across Denman, just note how many for sale signs there are.
We don't.
And that's the end of my comment on that.
We noted.
Yeah.
We saw that on the way over.
Secondly, I want to say I've read the act a long time ago, but your business model is flawed. It doesn't work. It can't work because it presumes that there's an infinite pool of people who don't care how much money they spend on ferries. And that won't get by economics 101. And until what the province is going to do about its part is nailed down and defined, we haven't got a business plan. You don't have a business plan. You have an impossibility.
So just remember, we're regulators. We don't have a business plan. We regulate the company that has the business plan.
No, the province is the owner. It doesn't have a business plan.
Okay. But I just want to clarify, Sheldon and I are the commission, just the two of us.
No question.
Okay.
No question on that. But the business plan that you are required to regulate doesn't work. Because there's no place to find all the money that's needed. I want to say that you can raise the ferry fares all you want, but it doesn't mean I'm going to pay anymore. And I am using the ferries less. And I'm getting health to pay for it more. And the people who are suffering from this are the merchants of the Comox Valley. I do a lot of shopping by email now that I used to go in and do. So you said you're concerned about defining who's the clients. Oh yeah, you chose to live here theory. When I chose to live here 15 years ago, ferry fares were reasonable, they were low, in the grand scheme of things they were trivial. Now they're outrageous. My son and his wife came up a few months ago. Their experience card or convenience card, or whatever you call that thing, didn't have enough money on it. The person at the cash desk didn't ask them if they wanted to put more on, and they paid $90-something to get to Hornby Island. That's my son. He doesn't come very often now. And that doesn't include the Nanaimo ferry. So, when I chose to live here, I didn't know that the ferry fares were going to quadruple. Nobody told me that. Publicity. I happened to be here because I saw an ad about that big in the paper last Thursday. And if you're wondering why there aren't many people here, I'd suggest that's why. Seasons. If there were no summer season, if there were no parks on Hornby, if there were no beaches on Hornby, our ferry would be half the size, because that's all we need. By some calculations I did a few years ago, using loading data I got from BC Ferries, there are about 5,000 people on this island in the summer and 1,000 in the winter. I forgot what I was going to say next. Yeah. So, half the people who use that ferry do not live here. It doesn't matter whether they chose to live here or not. They choose to come here, at least they used to. And they're less and less. You hear the businesses or something. I'm not going to talk about that because I'm not one of them. But that fact never seems to get through to anybody who's plumbing anybody. But these aren't our ferry. This isn't our ferry. It's ferry for the people of BC to access their provincial parks that they want to come to get to the beaches. Thank you.
Okay, well, feel free to stop a second time if it lands.
Yeah.
Is there a speaker's list?
Do you want to give a speaker's list?
Sure, would you have it?
Maybe put your hands up.
I don't want to speak, but I'm just wondering how we're going to do this.
Okay, go ahead, Judith.
One thing that puzzles me is that the reference you made to the fact that on the big ferry, we call them the big ferries, on the that the percentage increase, the fare increase was 4%, and on the minor routes it was 8%. I've never been able to understand that, because the only way that the ferry can recoup anything, the only opportunity they have to make any money is on the big ferries, where they can sell people meals and knickknacks and all the rest of it, and where everything has to come to the island on those big ferries. They can't have no other option. Why is it that the big ferries percentage increase is smaller than on the minor routes, where people have lots of other options and where there is no possible way of recovering any? I mean, we can't make money off the people travelling on our little ferries while they're actually travelling. So, and also, the other issue, of course, is why isn't the ferry a highway? I mean, that's a huge issue for me. Because when I first came here, the fare was 10 cents for a passenger and $1 for a car. And I chose to live here, yeah, right. Anyway, but I am puzzled by that. Why do they keep bumping up our prices when the only people who are going to be able to who are having to pay that extra percentage are the people who live here or who maybe have summer homes and come here in the summer, whereas they can grab everybody on the big ferries and have a more possibility of not cost recovery but of profit. I don't get it.
I'm going to try to explain my understanding of it, but I don't want it to sound like I'm trying to defend it, because I don't really understand what was the thinking at the time either. But one of the principles that I mentioned to you is the Act originally required that there be an elimination of cross-subsidization between routes. So because the big ferries, as you call them, on the major routes, have the ridership they do, they spread their costs over more passengers, they're able to get by with lower increases in order to be sustainable. And they aren't getting any subsidies on those routes or any contributions, at least from the province or the federal government. But it is one of the big questions that we started off with when we were looking at the review, because small communities faced with 8% per year, that translates into a pretty big challenge. And given the volume between the major routes and the minor routes, a fairly small increase on the major routes would translate into a fairly large decrease on the minor routes. So, as we've traveled around, we've been discussing this issue. And of course, the one thing that we hear from the people that live and use the major routes is they don't particularly like the idea of paying more so the minor routes can pay less. What we're trying to land on is, what is the kind of fundamental public policy principle that should be guiding this? Because we think there's other public policy, on highways and elsewhere, that's about trying to spread costs evenly over all of the residents. So I've told you everything I know about how it came to be, but looking forward, definitely one of the things we want to talk about is whether this is a policy that needs to be revisited and to have good rationale to explain to the people who will have to pay a little more why that's the right thing to do.
Because for us, the 8% is added on to absolutely everything that comes to the island. I mean, food, services, the lot. It just, to me, it's grossly unfair. I just don't care.
Can I just add?
Yeah. Would you mind telling us your name?
Judith Lawrence. Judith Lawrence.
Thank you.
The disparity in the increases in the price gap between the major routes and the minor routes, I'm sorry, the disparity, as Gord says, has a lot to do with the fact that the major routes has so much more traffic levels that they can spread the costs over a greater volume of passengers. But the other factor is that under the existing legislation and the way it's a mechanical process of working out and calculating the price caps, we have to assume no increase in subsidy levels for the minor routes, which is a whole other issue. So we have to assume that there's no change in subsidy levels. And with rising costs and flat or declining traffic levels, that's what you get as an outcome.
Does that apply to bridges and highways too?
Well, that's another issue.
Not even highways, ferries.